Good morning, everyone. As introduced, I'm Maykon Jr. da Silva, but I'm not a doctor. I'm a second-year master's student working with Dr. Seth Nave at the University of Minnesota. And today I'll be sharing with you some of the findings of my master's research titled Managing Soybean Iron Deficiency Chlorosis with Agronomics and Economics. So I would like to start with these two questions here. What is iron deficiency chlorosis, and why is IDC a problem? So iron deficiency chlorosis is a soil-borne abiotic stress caused by a lack of soluble iron to the plants. In soybean, IDC is characterized by interveinal chlorosis of the leaves and overall stunting of the growth. Under severe conditions, IDC symptoms can include necrosis, reducing the amount of plant tissue available for photosynthesis, or even causing plant death. But why is IDC a problem? IDC is a problem because most often its symptoms result in significant yield reductions. Only in the United States, IDC is estimated to cause yield losses totaling $260 million annually. But you might ask, how does IDC occur in the field? Well, iron is the fourth most abundant mineral element in the Earth's crust, so IDC is not related to an absence of iron in the soil. The form or the type of iron present in the soil solution is what determines availability for plant uptake and consequently the incidence of IDC. Soybean plants, they prefer to take up the reduced, the more soluble form of iron, called ferrous iron. However, when iron becomes less soluble or more oxidized in the soil, which means it is in its ferric state, soybean plants cannot take it up. Without a sufficient supply of iron, chlorophyll formation needed for photosynthesis is restricted, resulting in IDC development. But you might also ask, well, what changes the type or the form of iron in the soil? There are many or several soil chemical factors and their interactions that can change the solubility of iron in the soil or provide a difficult environment for plant-mediated iron reduction mechanisms, and one of them is high soil pH. In alkaline soils with a pH ranging from 7.4 to 8.5, iron precipitates as iron hydroxides. The problem is that these iron hydroxides, they have very low solubility in the soil, reducing iron availability and causing deficiencies. Another soil factor is high levels of calcium carbonates. In the soil, calcium carbonates, they act as a strong base, raising the soil pH and oxidizing ferrous iron to ferric iron, again causing deficiencies. In addition, calcium carbonates, they also neutralize the hydrogen protons and organic acids that soybean roots release into the rhizosphere to acidify this region immediately surrounding the roots and promote the solubilization of ferric chelates, serving as a buffer against these plant-mediated iron reduction mechanisms. A third factor is residual soil nitrate. When nitrate is excessively present in the soil, soybean plants preferentially take up nitrate instead of doing biological fixation of nitrogen, and in the process, they release bicarbonates to balance intracellular charge. The problem is that these bicarbonates also show a buffering effect, neutralizing the hydrogen protons and organic acids that were meant to convert less soluble ferric iron to more soluble ferrous iron. And a fourth factor is high soil moisture content. Wet soils are prone to IDC because in a limited air-exchanging environment, CO2 produced through respiration is trapped in soil water. The problem is that this trapped CO2 is then dissolved, resulting in a buildup of bicarbonates. As I just mentioned, buffering caused by bicarbonates limits the conversion of unavailable ferric iron to more available ferrous iron, an important step in iron uptake by soybean plants. Due to the large impact of IDC on soybean production, growers have adopted several management strategies to mitigate IDC. Among the most often used ones are variety selection, iron chelate application, and increased seeding rates. Growing a highly tolerant variety has long been suggested as the most important and most practical strategy for IDC management. Highly tolerant varieties, they possess an increased capacity to reduce less soluble ferric iron to more soluble ferrous iron, enhancing iron uptake. Differently, highly susceptible varieties, they do not possess the same capacity to reduce less soluble ferric iron to more soluble ferrous iron, or they do it at a slower rate. Because of that, growing a highly tolerant variety is considered fundamental for profitable production in IDC-prone soils. Iron chelates, what are they? Iron chelates are synthetic or naturally derived products that bind a metal cation, in this case iron, through multiple sites, protecting it from precipitation and thus keeping iron available in the soil for longer periods of time for plant uptake. I have highlighted, it might be hard to see, but I have highlighted iron EDDHA, DTPA, and EDTA because they are the most common forms of iron chelate utilized, but they vary in effectiveness. But what is important here is that iron chelates are used to keep iron soluble and available in the soil. Increased seeding rates have also been used and have shown positive effects. But what is the mechanism behind this population effect? Well, when the seeding rate is increased, that is, the number of plants per unit of row is larger, there is a larger amount of hydrogen protons and organic acids being released into the rhizosphere by soybean roots, increasing the reductive capacity and acidification of this region immediately surrounding the roots, increasing iron availability. It is important to emphasize, though, that this population effect is due to plant-to-plant interactions in a very short distance. So within row spacing is the key here. Well, although growers seek management strategies that mitigate IDC, they are primarily concerned with inputs that maximize economic returns and minimize risk. Because different management strategies can come at significant expense to soybean growers, the trade-offs in cost and yield associated with their utilization may not maximize economic returns and may increase risk. Therefore, in order to overcome the problem and ensure profitability, effective and economical solutions are needed. And this is what we are trying to do here. So the main goals of our research project are to examine the trade-offs and interactive effects between varieties, populations, and iron chelate rates across a range of IDC stress levels. And also to evaluate the impact of each of these three management strategies alone and in combination on overall economic returns. So to accomplish the goals of our study, on-farm paired factorial experiments were conducted in western Minnesota on soils where soybean has historically exhibited mild to severe iron deficiencies. In 2021, we planted our study at 3 locations, and in 2022 at 2 locations. In addition to varied intensity of IDC, plots were planted in 2 areas within each producer field, which we called site. So one site was planted in the hotspot IDC part of the field, where symptoms were expected to be severe, and the other site was planted in the non-hotspot IDC part of the field, where symptoms were expected to be lower. And that resulted in 10 unique field sites, or 10 unique environments. We evaluated 24 treatments representing the combination of all 4 main factors and their levels. So we tested 2 varieties, a moderately tolerant and a highly tolerant variety, 2 seeding rates, 125 and 175,000 seeds per acre, 3 iron chelate rates, 0, 2, and 4 pounds of soy green AST, which is a commercial form of iron EDDHA per acre, and 2 levels of IDC intensity by supplemental nitrogen. In this case, in 50% of the plots, we applied 69 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and in the other 50%, we did not apply nitrogen. So nitrogen application is an efficient protocol developed to increase IDC intensity within environments, and it has been previously used by the NAVE lab in other IDC studies. After emergence, each plot was weekly evaluated for IDC symptoms using a 1 to 5 visual rating scale, popularly called Greenest scores. In such rating system, a score of 1 indicates that the whole plot is green, that there is no chlorosis, no IDC symptoms, and a score of 5 indicates most severe IDC symptoms with a lot of necrosis, plants dying, or even death. This figure over here is going to be very important for us to understand the results, so I kind of ask you to at least try to remember what each of these scores represent in terms of IDC symptomology. Because hotspot and non-hotspot is not a perfect way to classify IDC intensity across environments, that is, IDC severity varies from a hotspot at Danvers to a hotspot at Graysville or at Foxham, an environmental index was created to better account for this variation in IDC symptomology. As I mentioned before, nitrogen in the soil, especially in the form of nitrate, increases IDC severity, and that's what we observe in the field when we apply nitrogen, and that's what I'm trying to show here with these 2 figures. So this environmental index was then calculated as the average Greenest scores that are 5.5 for the control treatment, so the moderately tolerant variety without iron chelate application planted at a lower seeding rate with or without nitrogen application. And that resulted in what we call 20 IDC environments. Like I mentioned before, we had 10 unique field sites. By the 2 nitrogen levels, we apply nitrogen to increase IDC severity, those 50% of the plots, we have 20 IDC environments. So this environmental index is basically a measure of how severe IDC was at each of these 20 IDC environments based on the average greenness scores at R5.5 for the control treatment. In terms of economic analysis, we used a partial budget analysis to evaluate the net economic returns of each of the treatment combinations relative to the control treatment. And this was done separately within each of these 20 IDC environments. For the purpose of profitability assessment and the risk analysis, which I'll talk in more detail later, all these 20 IDC environments were classified into 3 groups based on the environmental index values calculated for the control treatment. So an environmental index lower than 1.5 was considered low IDC. An environmental index between 1.5 and 2.5 was considered moderate IDC. An environmental index greater than 2.5 was considered severe IDC. Furthermore, net economic returns were combined across low and moderate IDC because an ANOVA for grain yield showed that these treatment combinations performed similarly within these 2 classes. So for the partial budget analysis, net cost was considered as the change in seed cost, for each variety in seeding rate plus the change in iron chelate rate. Net revenue was considered as the changing revenue from changing grain yield and sale price. And then the net economic return was calculated as the difference between net revenue and net cost. So results and discussion. Let's take a look at the variety effects first. The first thing that this graph shows is that for every 1 single point increase in IDC severity measured by the environmental index, the yield of the moderately tolerant variety was reduced by an average of 4 bushels per acre, while the yield of the highly tolerant variety was reduced by an average of 0.9 bushels per acre. That might not sound a lot at first, but when we move from an environmental index of 1 to an environmental index of 4, we have about 13 bushels per acre yield difference just by switching the variety. And that's why I mentioned before that growing a highly tolerant variety is considered the most important and most practical strategy for IDC management. Just by switching the variety, we increase grain yield by about 13 bushels per acre where IDC was severe. But what this graph also shows is that even when IDC was low to moderate, as we can see over here where the environmental index was of 1, the highly tolerant variety tended to yield about 3 bushels per acre more than the moderately tolerant variety. With that, I would like to say that in our study, an environmental index of 1 or an average greenness scores of 1 at R5.5 does not indicate that IDC did not occur. In our study, IDC occurred at all environments with different intensities. The thing is that soybean plants, they can recover from IDC towards the end of the growing season. And that could result in an average greenness scores of 1 at R5.5. And that's the case over here. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this because it's not only important to manage or use management strategies that are effective at minimizing losses in areas where IDC is severe. It's also important to use these management strategies in areas where IDC is low to moderate as well. And over here, I would also like to point out that some of you might be thinking about the yield potential of each of these 2 varieties. With that, I would like to say that we only had one field site where IDC was very low, almost absent. The average greenness score at R1, where IDC was most severe, was 1.25. So very low IDC, but there was still some IDC. And in that field site, both varieties yielded nearly the same. So it's not this yield difference here is not because the highly tolerant variety has a greater or a higher yield potential. But what a third thing that this graph shows, and what I would also like to show with this figure over here, is that when IDC, even the highly tolerant variety experience yield reductions when severe IDC conditions prevail. And what does it mean? This means that growing a highly tolerant variety alone may not be enough to achieve high yields where severe IDC conditions prevail. And then this question might arise, well, what is the best way to manage severe IDC then? Overall, the best way to manage severe IDC is to pair a highly tolerant variety with another management strategy that minimizes losses. And that could be iron chelate application. To talk about the iron chelate rate effects, let's look at this figure on the right side of the graph. On the right side of the figure, we have a control plot. So a moderately tolerant variety without iron chelate application, planted at a lower seeding rate, and in this plot, we apply nitrogen. So the greenest score for this plot would be of 4. So the environmental index in this scenario would be of 4. And on the left, we have a plot with the same treatments, but at which we applied 4 pounds of iron chelate per acre in furrow at planting. What I'm trying to say here? I'm trying to say that the grower who owns this farm in Graceville, Minnesota, he could have a soybean field that is going to yield about 50 bushels per acre, or a soybean field that is going to yield less than 25 bushels per acre. And that's almost 25 bushel per acre yield difference just by applying 4 pounds of iron chelate per acre in furrow at planting. Okay, although the largest yield differences were seen at higher IDC intensities, as I just mentioned, that graph also shows that iron chelate application also tended to increase soybean yield in areas where IDC was low to moderate, as shown over here, where the environmental index of 1, which reinforces our previous findings that although soybean plants can in some cases effectively overcome IDC towards the end of the growing season, recovery will only reduce the yield loss, but it will not eliminate it. So again, it's also extremely important to manage these low to moderate IDC areas. Now let's take a look at the interaction between varieties and iron chelate rates. The first thing that this graph shows is that iron chelate application, regardless of rate, significantly increased the yield of both varieties. We can see that applying 4 pounds of iron chelate per acre tended to produce the highest yields, but we don't have enough evidence to say that these yields were significantly higher than applying 2 pounds of iron chelate per acre. But a second thing that this graph shows is that the effect of iron chelate application was greater for the moderately tolerant variety compared to the highly tolerant one. We can see here that when we applied iron chelate on the moderately tolerant variety, we increased soybean yield by more or less an average of 14 bushels per acre. While when we applied iron chelate on the highly tolerant variety, we increased soybean yield by an average of 10 bushels per acre. And why is that? That's because the moderately tolerant variety needs it more. Without iron chelate application, the moderately tolerant variety yielded significantly less than the highly tolerant one. But what is most important here, and what I would like you to focus on, is that although the effect of iron chelate application was greater for the moderately tolerant variety compared to the highly tolerant one, the highest yields were achieved by having a highly tolerant variety combined with iron chelate application. And this is very important, and it ties back to what I was saying before, that combining these two management strategies appears to be a very good alternative or a good decision to achieve high yields. And lastly, we have the main effect of population. We can see in this population graph here that increasing the seeding rate from 125 to 175,000 seeds per acre significantly increased grain yield by an average of 2 bushels per acre. Yes, this was a smaller effect compared to the iron chelate application and the varieties, but it's more important here that this effect was consistent. It was consistent across IDC intensities because we did not find an interaction with the environmental index, and it was also consistent across treatment combinations because we did not find an interaction with other management strategies. But what I believe is even more important here is that these 2 bushels per acre that we are gaining here should at least pay for the extra 50,000 seeds that we are adding to switch the seeding rate from 125 to 175,000 seeds per acre. Okay, partial budget analysis. Let's take a look at the net economic returns for low to moderate IDC conditions first. The first thing that this graph shows is that only 4 treatment combinations significantly increase profitability compared to the control treatment, suggesting that not all management strategies that significantly increase grain yield will also significantly increase profitability, which was kind of expected. We talked about the trade-offs before, right? But what is most important here, what I believe to be most important, is that all these 4 treatment combinations that significantly increase profitability compared to the control, they included a highly tolerant variety with at least one of the other 2 management strategies, either iron chelate application or increasing the seeding rate, which is again very important. I said before, growing a highly tolerant variety should always be the first line of defense against IDC, both in terms of yield and now profitability as well. Differently, under severe IDC conditions, all treatment combinations significantly increase profitability compared to the control, except for the combination of a moderately tolerant variety without iron chelate application and planted at an increased seeding rate. This higher number of treatment combinations being significantly more profitable than the control may be a result of the need for alternatives to minimize severe IDC. Without any management strategies to restrain or minimize symptoms, severe IDC could result in a complete crop failure. Therefore, by adopting at least one management strategy shown to be effective at minimizing losses, growers can significantly increase profitability in areas where IDC is severe. Overall, the treatment combination that provided the highest net economic return compared to the control under severe conditions was the combination of a highly tolerant variety with 2 pounds of iron chelate per acre planted at an increased seeding rate, which was $540 per acre more profitable than the control treatment. Okay, so the results of each profitability assessment were also used in a risk-efficient frontier analysis based on the modern portfolio theory. This approach basically reveals how soybean growers can maximize economic returns while controlling the risk, or minimize the risk while targeting a desired level of return. As such, a grower's choice of what management strategies to use is like an investor's choice of what stocks to invest in a stock portfolio. And it's based on the variability of net economic returns. So if a grower wants to minimize risk, then this grower would go with the minimum variance choice, which is basically the portfolio of treatment combinations or portfolio of management strategies that provides the lowest variability in net economic returns. Alternatively, if the same grower wants to maximize returns for a controlled level of risk, then this grower would go with the optimum portfolio, which is basically the portfolio of management strategies that maximize the Sharpe ratio. And what is the Sharpe ratio? The Sharpe ratio is a calculation that we do to estimate the amount of reward or return per unit of risk. So the higher the Sharpe ratio, the higher the expected return for every unit of risk. So what are the results for the low to moderate IDC conditions? So if a grower wants to minimize risk under low to moderate IDC conditions, then this grower would go to the field and plant 50% of the field with this treatment combination, 35% of the field with this treatment combination, and 15% of the field with that treatment combination. And that would be accomplished with the use of variable rate equipment or variable rate technology. Alternatively, if the same grower wants to maximize returns for a control level of risk, then this grower would plant the whole field with this treatment combination, the combination of a highly tolerant variety with 2 pounds of soy grain per acre and at the lower seeding rate. But we do understand that it may not be practical from a farmer standpoint to make use of a portfolio of management strategies, or it may not even be possible due to variable rate equipment. So we also tried to determine what was the best single option for each of these IDC conditions. And we got to the conclusion that the best single option, both in terms of reward and risk for low to moderate IDC conditions, was the combination of a highly tolerant variety with 2 pounds of iron chelate per acre and planted at a lower seeding rate. And why was that? That's because this treatment combination was only about $1 more risky than the minimum variance choice, and it coincided with the optimum portfolio when it comes to the Sharpe ratio. So that was the best single option for low to moderate IDC conditions, both in terms of risk and reward, or economic returns. Differently, under severe IDC conditions, both minimum variance choice and optimum portfolio were provided by a combination of portfolios. And like I said again, it may not be practical from a farmer standpoint, or it may be even not possible because of variable rate equipment. So again, we tried to define what was the best single option for these moderate severe IDC conditions. And we got to the conclusion that the best single option for these areas was the combination of a highly tolerant variety with 4 pounds of iron chelate per acre in furrow wet planting, planted at an increased seeding rate. And why is that? Because that treatment combination was only about $10 more risky than the minimum variance choice, and it was only 0.03 points lower in terms of the Sharpe ratio than the optimum portfolio. So both in terms of risk and reward or expected returns, the combination of a highly tolerant variety with 4 pounds of iron kiloid per acre planted at an increased seeding rate, the best option for severe IDC conditions. So the final message I want to leave today relates to this question here. Can we estimate the yield potential of each of these plots? On top here, we have a very good example of how destructive IDC can be when poor management strategies are adopted. It's very unlikely that soybean fields like those yellow plots will ever recover in a way that growers will achieve reasonable grain yields at the end of the growing season. However, at the bottom here, we have a completely different situation. These green plots, they were right next to the yellow ones, and they yielded very well at the end of the growing season. So this is another very good example that we can manage IDC in a way that we can still achieve high yields, even in areas where IDC is severe. And that's by adopting good or the correct management strategies. I would just like to say a big thanks to the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council for funding this project, and also the University of Minnesota and Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics for the opportunity. And I'll take any questions now if I still got some time left.
Yes, you do. We have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Okay.
Any questions? Go ahead, Grant.
So what was the soil test values in those plots? Was it driven by carbonates or was it driven by salts?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and does it take about 60 pounds of carryover nitrate to trigger the worst of the worst in those situations?
Very good question. So all of these soils, they had a pH in the range of 8 or more than that, sometimes even 8.8, so they were very alkaline soils. Calcium carbonates were very elevated as well, and soluble salts. So all those 3 factors, which are very important for IDC occurrence, they were present in the soils where we planted these trials.
So the salts would have been above 1.7 millimoles or?
Around 5 in this study.
Salts were?
Yeah, very high. So we had some field trials that IDC was extremely severe. The control plots, they basically burned down. We couldn't harvest anything. They were this tall, a lot of necrosis. The plants died at the end of the growing season. Yeah. And then regarding nitrate, that's a very good question as well. We tested the effect of nitrogen with the application of 69 pounds per acre. So that triggered this effect, this nitrate effect. I cannot say like how much less than that would still trigger that effect. I cannot say. I can say that 69 pounds in our study did trigger the effect. But another study would be nice to evaluate, like, okay, different rates of nitrogen to see as well.
Because you don't have base nitrate carryover in the soil on this type of stuff. So
okay.
If you had 30 and you put 69 on top, you know, what would be, like you said, be interested to find out what level of nitrates.
Yes. And that's a very good point. In our study, we applied nitrogen because we couldn't measure how much nitrate was left from the previous crop. So we didn't know if that nitrate left in the soil would actually trigger the effect or not. That's why we apply nitrogen, because we wanted to have the effect. But why did we apply nitrogen? We apply nitrogen because we wanted to mimic a situation in which we have excessive nitrate present in the soil, and that's especially coming from the previous crop. And last year, we did see more IDC, and I strongly believe that we saw more IDC because of the nitrate that was left from the corn from the previous season. 2021, if I'm not mistaken, was fairly dry. So that nitrogen that was applied in the corn could have stayed in the field. It was not taken up by the plant. There was no water to wash it out. So that nitrogen remained in the field and could have caused a big effect on the soybeans. So that's why we apply nitrogen, to mimic that effect.
One last question.
Does soybean or iron chili even out the maturity of the crop in the field?
If it affects maturity? So with soybean? Yes, we did see that. We did see that the plots at which we did not apply soybean or increase the seeding rate, or the plots that were affected the most by IDC, the maturity was delayed, and it was delayed by about 2 weeks. Yeah, it's a problem for us when we have to harvest these plots, because most of the plots are ready, but those that suffered a lot from IDC, they are not. So those that we treated with soybean, with the variety as well, and the increased seeding rates, they matured a lot earlier. Yeah, or they had normal maturity. The problem is that those that were affected delayed maturity.
Thank you so much,
Yeah,
Dean.
thank you.